Every time a high season of the church year rolls around, like Lent to Easter, Advent to Christmas, we look for compelling biblical threads that tie our worship together. Broad strokes are there already every year. Advent is about waiting, preparing for God's salvation in Jesus and the mystery and wonder of Emmanuel, God with us. Lent, that we are in beginning today, is a season of fasting, repentance, embracing the wilderness, moving from cross and suffering to resurrection and life. But we always ask, what's the particular emphasis this time? What is the gospel word for us here and now in this season of this year? One obvious thing shows up this year, the second year of the cycle. There's a lot in the Old Testament scriptures especially about covenant. God's covenant with Noah, with creation, with Abraham and his descendants, and more. So what is covenant? Covenant is located in the space between. In any relationship, there is some shared space between. A covenant establishes how participants function in that space. Covenant defines the space, gives it a shape. That's why we're calling this worship series Living Between. All the joy, all the struggle occurs as we try to navigate life in this space between ourselves and God, between ourselves and the church, the world, creation, even often between parts of ourselves that are at odds within us. At this particular time in our history as a culture and as a church, the space between is often fraught with pain and confusion, where chaos and violence often enter into that space. So maybe this is a very good year for some rich biblical reflection and application about living between. So today we look at this space between God and Noah, or more accurately, between God and all creation. When God established a covenant with creation, right after all but destroying it. I've preached on this flood story before. It comes around once every 3 years. And this is a new sermon, but you may hear me say a few things I've said before. This year in particular, the message of the story, as I understand it, I think bears repeating. It's important. I was feeling that even before Thursday's school shooting in Florida. I feel it even more strongly now. This flood story tells us a lot about God, and it's not what you might think. It's a picture of God that we need to grasp right now more than ever. This story is, at the same time, an endearing and whimsical children's favorite, with all the cute animals walking up the plank in pairs and going for a long boat ride. And it's one of the most horrific tales of destruction carried out at God's hands against humanity and creation. It's a challenge for thinking people to reconcile these two stories that are the same story. I'll put aside for this sermon all the debates that Christians love to have about this story, about whether it happened and how it might have happened and where the ark is now and all manner of other silly questions. My faith does not rise or fall on whether I figure out a way to believe that this was historical fact. I'm sad that for some people it does seem to rise or fall on that, because I think they're missing the beautiful heart of this story. Let's not make the mistake of reading this as history or science. It is neither one. It is theology. This biblical story is one of many ancient stories about a worldwide flood. These stories come from many different ancient civilizations: Mesopotamia, Babylonian stories, Sumerian, Hindu, and more. Many of them are older than this Hebrew story of ours. All of them, the Noah story included, attempt through story to explain what kind of God or gods sit above the universe and exercise control over it. The stories have many similarities and many differences. We don't say that one is historically true and the other's not. They all have the same purpose, and they all succeed. They successfully give their civilization a picture to help them make sense of the world, in the world that they live, in particular their god or gods, how they act in relationship to the human beings and the earth. The Genesis story grows out of the particular experience of the Hebrew people with their God, Yahweh. Other stories grow out of other life experiences of people and other civilizations, and they all teach about divine nature and human nature. It's what they teach that sets them apart. Genesis 6 to 9, I believe, is divinely inspired Holy Scripture. Not because it teaches me good science, but because it tells me the truth about God. It tells me something that lines up with the rest of the biblical witness about God and lines up with my experience of God. The other stories do not. At least not for me and not for us. Let me tell you why not. And this is a gross oversimplification. I'm lumping different stories together for the sake of time. In other ancient flood stories, the gods seem more concerned about their own struggle for power over each other, and humanity is a mere annoyance that keeps getting in the way of these gods' cosmic plans. In one story, the Council of Gods cooks up a plan for a big flood to destroy pesky humanity forever. One lesser god sneaks away and spills the secret to the human hero of the story, who builds a big boat, saving himself and his family and the animals. When the gods find out, the chief gods are furious that a human survived. So the other gods, who thought the chief gods had gone too far, make the human survivor immortal into a god himself and send him away into a life in another world, safe from the gods who want him dead. End of the story. And the gods keep fighting. The underlying assumption in many of these stories is that the gods are mostly uninterested in us and are locked in eternal combat with the other gods or with us. So we humans must do all we can to appease the gods, to calm them down by burning incense to them or feeding them or otherwise distracting them with something they like. And if we do that, then they won't lash out in anger and destroy us. Now, what does Genesis 6 to 9 tell us? There are some serious people who read this, and what they see, first and foremost, is a violent God with a vendetta against the sinful world, eager to destroy it. But if we read it carefully, with these other flood stories in mind, we see that Genesis tells us a radically different story about a radically different God. The one God who created all life and sustains that life out of everlasting love. Here we see not a God who was angry and resentful, but we see a broken-hearted God. The Hebrew word used to describe God's feelings before the flood is not the word for anger, but for pain, hurt, grief. God was brokenhearted by all the wickedness on the earth, all the violence, the corruption, the chaos covering the earth. This was chaos that humans brought on themselves. It was not God's doing and not God's desire. Humans rejected the shalom that God created and intended for them. So in this flood story, God does in the natural realm what humans had already done spiritually and relationally. Covered the earth with chaos. Water, a symbol of chaos, overwhelms the earth. And now the physical reality that God wrought matches the spiritual reality that humans had already wrought. But then when the flood goes down, we see where this version of the flood story really stands alone. We see the core character of this one God, Yahweh, most clearly in what happens afterward. Instead of ending the story with the gods and humans locked in mortal combat and the human hero escaping the earth and escaping humanity, the Genesis story restores the divine human communion. It establishes a covenant, a one-way covenant in which God takes full and complete responsibility to sustain human life and help it flourish. Because of love, God is deeply moved after the flood, moved to anguish and even regret at such massive destruction. So instead of continuing to rage against humanity and creation, God lays down a bow as a sign for himself to never again destroy the earth. Chapter 9, verse 15, I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember the covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. So God moves toward humans and toward the earth in love and lays down his weapon. Numerous scholars have pointed out that the rainbow was not an arbitrary shape, just a splash of color across the sky. It was a bow, a weapon of war. In other words, in other stories, the gods kept up their battle. The God of the Bible, our Bible, laid down his weapon of war against creation, and made an everlasting, unilateral, unconditional covenant of love. The promise to sustain life and help it flourish. So when we read Genesis against the backdrop of other stories and read it not as history or science, but as theology, we see how wrong we really are if we make this into a horror story about a violent God. the best interpretation, taking everything into its known context, gives us a good news picture, a gospel picture, painted to show us a God of boundless mercy and love and tenderness toward all humans and all creation with no conditions attached. The brokenness and chaos continues in this world. As bad, if not worse, than it was before the flood. But we have this story to give us hope. God laid down God's weapon, never to pick it up again. The human story will not end with destruction, but with the restoring of shalom. The covenant, the space between God and creation, is still intact. It's still holding up, despite the rampant violence in our world. Violent tragedies that still occur in our world, such as the senseless shootings in Parkland, Florida, carried out by a deeply broken young man. And such as the senseless wars around the world carried out by legitimate world powers claiming to do good. Such as violent rhetoric toward people different from us. Such as the pervasive sexual violence that continues unchecked, unspoken of, and often without consequence. Such as the systemic discrimination that continues in our culture and even in our church, that make it more difficult for people of color or women or young people to have a real say in how things get done. The space between continues to be filled with chaos and violence. Today's covenant story from Genesis reminds us that we need not despair. We are not left to our own devices forever. We are not about to be forgotten by God and left to oblivion. Yes, we should be concerned. Yes, we should care. Yes, we should act. But we should not lose hope. And we should cling to this unconditional promise of God. Every time we see a rainbow in the sky, we should remember that God is seeing it too. And it's reminding God to keep God's promise. God will never again make chaos in creation as a way to combat the chaos that we ourselves make. God will stick with us for life and for love. The image from the shootings in Florida that will no doubt become iconic for years to come is those two weeping mothers comforting each other, and one of them has ashes on her forehead. Did you notice that? In the sign of the cross. I haven't heard any journalist comment on the ashes, but they practically shouted to me that late Ash Wednesday evening when I saw the photo. Here's a woman who just hours earlier was in a church worshiping, being reminded of our collective sinfulness and mortality and being reminded of God's grace. And now she's standing there in the middle of human chaos and sin and violence with a cross of ashes on her head, clinging to hope, a hope available to us who believe that our Creator God keeps faith with creation. Chaos will not have the last word. That word belongs to God. And it's a word of love. To conclude, let us join in a prayer of confession as printed in the bulletin. I'll begin, and then you respond. God of love, God of shalom, God of salvation, we recognize your rule over the creation you love. We acknowledge our failure to love as you love. We confess our sin in not trusting your love and provision as we take matters into our own hands and seek to maintain our power through violence. Forgive us for making your love too small. Teach us to act with humility, grace, and mercy as we seek to join you in making things right. All the paths of God are loving and faithful for those who keep God's covenant.